The chamber hums with the low murmur of voices, the shuffle of papers, the restless energy that fills the air before something breaks. A microphone pops, sharp, metallic, and all at once, the noise tightens into silence. Representative Jasmine Crockett leans forward, poised, her words deliberate, her tone calm but edged with quiet strength. "Mr. Speaker." With all due respect, she doesn't finish. Mike Johnson cuts in, voice firm, carrying the weight of practiced authority. The gentlewoman will yield her time. The words land like a gavel. The interruption slices through the stillness. Every camera catches it, the flicker in his eyes, the faint tightening of her jaw. Crockett's gaze doesn't waver. She inhales once, slow, measured. The silence stretches so long it becomes unbearable. In that breath, something changes. The narrator's voice breaks the tension, low and steady. No one expected what came next. Not the press, not the speaker, not even the audience sitting in stunned silence. Whispers ripple through the chamber. A pen clatters to the floor. A staffer looks up from their notes, sensing the shift before it happens. Crockett doesn't move, but her stillness is electric. The kind that pulls gravity toward her dot across the aisle. Johnson straightens, waiting for submission, for compliance. But the look in Crockett's eyes says otherwise. This isn't just another exchange. It's something else, an unspoken line being drawn in real time. The narrator continues. A single interruption became a national headline. A few seconds of silence turned into a storm. Screens will replay this moment again and again, but no replay will capture what it felt like inside that room. The tension, the breath held in collective disbelief, the faint sense that something bigger than politics was about to unfold. The speaker adjusts his papers, unaware he's already lost control of the story. Crockett exhales softly, her voice returning with a calm that cuts sharper than any shout. And from that calm, history begins to shift. By the time she finishes, the entire room will have changed. But to understand why this moment hit so hard, you need to see what led up to it. Long before that moment froze the chamber, tension had been simmering beneath the marble and microphones. Washington had grown tired of gridlock, of soundbites dressed as solutions, of civility used as a weapon. Every hearing had become theater, every exchange a contest for dominance, but this one was different. It carried the weight of something deeper, something personal, across the weeks leading to it. The country had watched its lawmakers spar over everything from budgets to basic rights. But beneath the policy battles, another war had taken shape, a quieter one, built on tone, interruption, and the subtle art of silencing. Women of color who dared to speak too firmly were labeled angry. Those who refused to yield were called unprofessional. Their composure wasn't praised. It was tested. Jasmine Crockett knew that test all too well. She had walked into every room aware of the invisible expectations waiting to box her in, too loud, too bold, too much. But that awareness had become her armor. When others raised their voices, she raised her precision. When they threw insults, she threw facts. Every interruption only sharpened her resolve. On the other side of the chamber sat Mike Johnson, a man who wore power like a perfectly tailored suit. His tone was calm, his diction rehearsed, his confidence absolute. He didn't shout, he didn't have to. Authority was built into his voice. To the cameras, he appeared measured, respectable, a man in command. But to those who listened closely, his calm was control disguised as courtesy. The clash between them wasn't about policy anymore. It was about power, the kind that doesn't show up in the record but lives in every pause, every cut-off sentence, every forced smile. Crockett's restraint became an act of defiance. Her poise, her refusal to flinch, was louder than any outrage. The narrator's voice lowers, threading tension through the air. Every camera in that room was rolling, but not everyone knew they were about to witness history. Staffers typed quietly, glancing between screens, and the two figures locked in silent duel. Johnson spoke with the authority of his title. Crockett spoke with the authority of truth. And for the first time in a long while, truth refused to yield. Outside the chamber, the storm of commentary had already begun, reporters sensing a spark, headlines forming before the fire had even caught. The questions were the same as always. Why did she push back? Why couldn't she let it go? Few asked why she had been interrupted in the first place. That's how power protects itself, by pretending. Every reaction is the problem, but Crockett knew better. She wasn't there to perform outrage. She was there to hold her ground, and in that stillness, her presence became something larger than herself. A mirror for every person who had ever been told to wait their turn while someone else took the microphone. The narrator pauses, because before that fateful shutdown moment, the speaker's own contradictions were already catching up with him. Before the interruption that set the internet ablaze, Mike Johnson's story had already been written in polished speeches and photo-ready moments. To his supporters, he was the picture of disciplined lawyer, husband, man of faith, the kind of politician who spoke softly but carried the confidence of divine approval. His rise from small-town attorney to Speaker of the House had been swift and calculated, the product of years spent mastering the language of moral certainty. In front of the cameras, he framed himself as the guardian of tradition. He talked about family, order, and responsibility, each word measured like scripture. He knew how to look humble while holding the gavel. Every appearance carried the same choreography, the pause before invoking faith, the smile that softened his warnings, the emphasis on restoring decency, but beneath that practiced civility was a man who wielded morality as a political weapon. He called it conviction. Others called it control. Old clips played across networks his statements on law and order, his calls for unity that somehow always excluded dissenting voices. He preached about law and order, the narrator murmurs, but only when it suited his allies. Cable anchors dissected his contradictions, their words flashing across screens like headlines on repeat. Speaker Johnson urges accountability, remains silent on party scandals. Faith and power. Where does conviction end and convenience begin? To his followers, Johnson was the man holding chaos at bay. To his critics, he was the chaos. Cloaked in reverence, the duality made him untouchable. Inside the Capitol, staffers knew the rhythm of his meetings: sharp, decisive, and always on his terms. His subordinates called him steady. His opponents called him strategic. But there was something else behind that steadiness, an unspoken certainty that he would not be challenged by those he deemed lesser, especially not by someone like Jasmine Crockett, a woman unafraid to look him in the eye when others lowered theirs. Narrator. He'd spent years mastering the art of calm authority, but calm is fragile when it's built on control. When Johnson ascended to the speakership, his allies celebrated a return to order. They said he brought moral clarity back to Washington. Yet every policy choice revealed the same selective lens: compassion in press conferences, cruelty in legislation. He condemned outrage, then quietly benefited from it. He called for bipartisanship, then punished dissent. His composure was not peace. It was pressure disguised as grace. Commentators replayed his contradictions side by side, his voice pleading for unity while votes rolled in dividing families. Cutting aid, silencing voices. The irony was not lost on anyone watching closely. The man who spoke most about decency had made a career out of defining who deserved it. For months, the press had whispered, could his calm hold? Could the mask ever slip? But no one expected the answer to come from a single interruption. In interviews, Johnson often invoked his past. I've always believed in faith over fury, he'd say, a subtle nod to those who equated restraint with righteousness. But that very belief had made him underestimate the kind of strength Crockett embodied, the strength of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. The story of Mike Johnson was a story of control, of how power convinces itself that politeness is virtue and obedience is order. His rise was built on predictability. He could command rooms, silence dissent, and walk away unshaken. But that night, facing someone who refused to yield, his familiar script began to falter. The chamber lights were unkind to confidence. They revealed the micro-expressions, the faint tightening of lips, the eyes narrowing when challenged. Crockett didn't have to expose him. The moment did it for her. Reporters later described it as the pause heard around the country. One headline read, "The speaker interrupted and regret followed." Another, "When calm meets conviction, Crockett's composure shifts the room." The imbalance of power was still there, written into the hierarchy of the chamber, but something subtle had flipped. The authority that once felt absolute now seemed defensive. Johnson, who prided himself on moral clarity, suddenly looked uncertain, like a man realizing his reflection no longer matched the image he'd sold to the nation. The narrator lowers his voice, deliberate and slow. He wasn't ready for someone who wouldn't flinch. And Jasmine Crockett, she'd spent her whole life learning to stay calm in the storm. Before that moment in the chamber, before the hush, before the viral clip that would echo across millions of screens, Jasmine Crockett was already forged in the quiet fire of resistance. Her story didn't begin with confrontation. It began with conviction. She was raised in Texas, a state where both beauty and injustice stretch wide across the horizon. Her upbringing wasn't drenched in privilege or political pedigree. It was rooted in hard work, church on Sundays, and an unshakable sense of right and wrong. As a child, she watched her parents stand tall in moments that demanded courage, even when no cameras were rolling. They didn't talk about politics. They talked about fairness. And somewhere between those dinner table conversations and the hum of a working-class neighborhood, Jasmine began to understand what justice really meant. Not just laws on paper, but lives in practice. Her early years as a lawyer were not glamorous. She took cases few others wanted, defending the voiceless, the overlooked, the forgotten. In courtrooms where she was often the youngest, and sometimes the only black woman, she learned how to make her voice heard without raising it. She stood for clients who couldn't afford legal protection, but deserved dignity all the same. Those experiences became her silent armor. Every cross-examination, every late-night case review, every verdict that turned against her only deepened her resolve. She didn't crave attention. She demanded accountability. There's an image that sticks in the minds of those who knew her then. Jasmine, at midnight, under the sterile glow of an office lamp, reading through pages of legislation no one else would bother to touch. Her colleagues had long gone home, but she stayed. Because somewhere in that fine print, in those clauses and some, lived the real stories, the ones affecting people with no lobbyists, no networks, no wealth to shield them. Those long nights taught her something. Power isn't in shouting the loudest, it's in knowing exactly what you're talking about when the shouting begins. When she entered public life, She carried that same energy with her, a mix of intellect, empathy, and righteous fire. She didn't speak to impress the room. She spoke to awaken it. Yet, the journey wasn't smooth. The political world has a way of testing conviction. There were times she was dismissed, interrupted, underestimated. Men with polished resumes and practiced smiles tried to talk over her. Journalists wrote her off as too passionate, as though passion were a flaw instead of a force. But every interruption she ever faced only made her sharper. Every attempt to silence her taught her new ways to be heard. That her rise wasn't about ambition, it was about endurance. Crockett's voice began to resonate beyond Texas. People saw a woman who didn't just speak for the unheard, she embodied them. She was the protester who became the policymaker, the defender who became the reformer. And even in her quietest moments, there was always movement behind her eyes, an awareness that change isn't just demanded. It's built brick by brick, law by law, truth by truth. Her speeches weren't rehearsed performances, they were lived experiences poured into words. When she spoke about civil rights, she wasn't citing history, she was carrying it. Every case she fought, every bill she studied, every protest she supported, all converged into a simple truth. Silence was never an option. It's easy to see her now standing at a podium, microphone clipped, lights glaring, and forget the years that led her there. The times she walked out of a courthouse in tears, only to return the next day stronger. The times she questioned whether the system could ever change and decided she'd change it anyway, and yet, amid the pressure in politics, there was always humanity. Those who've seen her off camera talk about her laughter, her grounding presence, her way of listening before speaking. For Jasmine Crockett, leadership was never about dominance, it was about understanding. She knew that true strength isn't in overpowering others. It's in outlasting the storm with integrity intact. That's what made her different. That's what made her dangerous to anyone who thrived on injustice. Because when she entered that congressional hearing room, she didn't come as a politician performing for applause. She came as a lawyer, an advocate, a fighter who'd already spent years navigating rooms designed to silence her. The speaker didn't know it then, but he wasn't interrupting a woman seeking spotlight. He was interrupting a lifetime of purpose. So when the gavel struck and voices began to rise, she didn't flinch. She had faced tougher crowds. She had stared down systems older and colder than that chamber. And when she finally spoke, measured, poised, unstoppable, it wasn't just a rebuttal. It was history answering back. Her journey reminds us that resilience isn't built overnight. It's sculpted through struggle, refined through rejection, and revealed in moments when silence would be easier, but truth refuses to wait. So when the speaker tried to silence her, he didn't just interrupt a congresswoman, he interrupted a movement. The chamber was alive, with a strange tension, half debate, half performance. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Everyone in that room knew the stakes weren't just about policy. They were about power. Jasmine Crockett sat poised behind the microphone, her notes neatly arranged, her posture deliberate, shoulders squared, eyes forward. When she finally began to speak, her tone wasn't fiery. It was focused. "Mr. Speaker," she began, voice steady, "the issue before us isn't about personalities or parties, it's about principle." There was a rhythm to her words, a calm defiance that drew the attention of even those who had come prepared to tune her out. Every sentence landed with precision, like a lawyer delivering an opening argument to a jury that had already made up its mind. But before she could finish her first point, Mike Johnson leaned forward. His voice cut through the air with the sharpness of authority. "The gentlewoman will yield," he said. A few heads turned. The familiar exchange, routine in form, dismissive in tone, hung in the air. Crockett paused, her pen hovering just above the paper. "Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, I will yield when I have concluded my statement." Johnson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's not how this chamber works," he replied, leaning on the procedural rules like a shield. A murmur rippled through the room. Staffers exchanged subtle glances. Cameras shifted. Something about the tone, something in the imbalance between his interruption and her composure changed the energy instantly. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "Mr. Speaker," she said again, this time slower, firmer. "Perhaps if I'm allowed to finish, we can all better understand the facts before us." It was the kind of sentence that sounded simple but carried centuries of weight. Every woman, every minority voice that had ever been told to wait, to stop, to yield before she was done. Johnson's gavel hit the desk once, an echo of authority. "The gentlewoman will yield, Mr. Speaker, if you would let me finish." "No, the gentlewoman will yield." The room seemed to freeze in that repetition. Words became weapons, rhythm became tension. It wasn't just an exchange, it was a struggle for space. The narrator's voice would later describe it like this. "In those few seconds, the conversation became a mirror showing us not just to politicians, but to versions of America, one that speaks, and one that's told to stop speaking." Crockett leaned forward slightly, her hand flat on the desk, the pen still in her grip. Her voice softened, but her eyes sharpened. "You may have the gavel, Mr. Speaker, but that doesn't mean you have the truth." Gasps flickered around the chamber. Not loud ones, not open defiance, but the kind of quiet reactions people have when they realize something irreversible has begun. Johnson straightened in his chair. trying to reassert dominance. Order: the gentlewoman is out of line. But Crockett wasn't out of line. She was defining it. The only line I'm crossing, she said, is the one drawn to silence, accountability. The moment landed like a gavel of its own, clean, heavy, final. The audience behind her shifted, some leaning in, others whispering under their breath. Even those who disagreed with her could feel the electricity in the air. For a heartbeat, Johnson didn't respond. Maybe he realized what had just happened, that his authority had met something it couldn't easily contain, and that was when the camera flashes began. A few seconds of tension turned into a national moment. The narrator's tone lowers here. In politics, control is often mistaken for leadership. But on that day, leadership looked like composure in the face of condescension. It looked like Jasmine Crockett refusing to yield. Her next words were calm, deliberate, surgical. If we can't let facts finish their sentences, then we've already silenced the truth. Silence. Pure, of heavy silence. You could almost hear the breath leave the room. Even those on Johnson's side of the aisle seemed uncertain how to proceed. No one dared interrupt her now. The hearing continued, but the tone had shifted. The chamber was no longer his theater, it was hers. Each word she spoke afterward carried not just logic, but presence. And then, just as the air began to settle, came the moment to pause. The glance, the line that would echo beyond that room. The narrator leans in, and then it happened. The moment that stopped the entire chamber. The silence stretched, sharp and unbearable, like the pause before a storm breaks. Every camera in the chamber had found her face, Jasmine Crockett, unshaken, unblinking, every muscle composed as if she'd rehearsed this exact kind of silence her whole life. But she hadn't. She had lived it. She looked up slowly, meeting Mike Johnson's gaze. 2 seconds passed, long enough for the speaker's confidence to flicker, long enough for the audience to feel something shift. Then, in a tone so measured it sliced through the air, she began. "Mr. Speaker," she said, "the danger in wielding power is forgetting why it was given to you." The first line landed like a quiet strike. No shouting, no drama, just clarity. A few murmurs echoed from the back. Johnson's smile tightened. He reached for the gavel, then stopped. Something about her voice, its composure, its inevitability froze him in place. Crockett continued. "Every time you silence a question, you silence the people who sent us here. You claim to defend order, but whose order is it when only one side gets to speak?" A staffer's pen dropped. Cameras clicked in a frenzy. The room was no longer a chamber of debate, it was a courtroom, and she was both witness and prosecutor. Johnson shifted in his seat. "The gentlewoman will refrain," she didn't raise her voice. "No, Mr. Speaker, I will continue." Gasps. Then quiet. Her next line came with surgical precision. "You preach about law and faith, but law without fairness is tyranny, and faith without empathy is nothing but theater." Someone in the press row whispered, "She really said that?" The sound of it, half disbelief, half admiration, rippled outward like wind through dry grass. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice deepening. "The truth doesn't need a gavel to be heard. It only needs courage to be spoken." Every word found its mark. Each pause carried more weight than a paragraph of rhetoric. Johnson blinked, unsure whether to respond or retreat. His face, once carved in authority, began to soften into something human, frustration, perhaps even doubt. And that's when she delivered the line that would echo through every feed, every clip, every headline for the next week. "Mr. Speaker," she said, "you can interrupt my words, but you can't rewrite their meaning." The crowd gasped, not because it was loud but because it was final. The narrator's voice cut in like a heartbeat. Behind the image, it wasn't anger that silenced the room. It was grace, the kind that holds its ground without apology. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. No papers shuffled. No phones buzzed. The chamber was a cathedral of quiet realization. Then, as if the spell had been broken, a murmur began. Someone at the back whispered, "That's going viral." Crockett gathered her notes. "And for the record," she added, "respect isn't obedience, it's earned by truth." The words hung there, almost glowing. Johnson tried to recover, clearing his throat. "The gentlewoman's time has expired." She smiled, soft, disarming, untouchable. Time always runs out for those avoiding accountability. The room cracked, soft laughter from one side, stifled disbelief from the other. Johnson's gavel struck once, more reflex than command. But the sound didn't land with authority anymore. It landed like surrender. The narrator whispered over the scene. "Some moments don't need thunder to make history, they just need silence to remember what courage sounds like." And outside those walls, history was already moving. Cut to a flurry of notifications, tweets, and headlines. Hashtags explode across screens. Hashtag Crockett vs. Johnson. Hashtag yield this. Hashtag she said it. A reporter's tweet flashes. She didn't raise her voice once, and she still shut the speaker down. A viral TikTok edit plays in split screen. Johnson's interruptions juxtaposed against Crockett's.com stare. Captions roll across the bottom. "Composure isn't weakness, it's power." The narrator overlays this storm with steady cadence. In a nation addicted to outrage, her calm became a revolution. Clips replay in slow motion, her pen tapping the desk. The pause before her rebuttal, the faint smile when she said "you can't rewrite their meaning," Cable news loops the segment with headline banners screaming, Crockett School's speaker in live hearing. Grace under fire, moment of the year. Commentators debate tone and decorum, but every viewer watching from home feels the same quiet electricity. They've seen countless arguments, but this one feels different, cleaner, sharper, undeniably human. One anchor says, she didn't win because she was loud. She won because she was right. Another adds, you could see it in Johnson's face. Authority met authenticity and lost. Meanwhile, online, the reactions pour in. A tweet with 400,000 likes reads, she said what millions were thinking. Another calm class courage. A third simply says, finally, someone spoke without fear. Through it all, Crockett herself remains silent. No victory posts, no interviews. Just a clip of her walking out of the chamber, phone in hand. Expression unreadable. The narrator softens. Some people chase the spotlight, others let it find them when truth demands it. As the music swells, the camera lingers on her face, composed, grounded, aware of what's coming. Because moments like this never stay contained. They ripple outward into headlines, into hashtags, into hearts. She wasn't just answering a man. She was answering a pattern. That sentence lands like a drumbeat, and then the montage builds, screens lighting up across the country, phones buzzing, group chats sharing the clip with captions like this right here, an iconic. A mother watches on her lunch break and texts her daughter, see, that's how you speak truth. A teacher plays the clip for a civics class. A young black girl rewatches it 3 times, whispering along, you can interrupt my words, but you can't rewrite their meaning. The narrator's tone grows reverent, cinematic. For every person who's ever been told to yield before they're done speaking, for every voice dismissed before it could finish its sentence, Jasmine Crockett just gave them a new ending. The sound fades, leaving only the echo of her words. Respect isn't obedience, it's earned by truth. And as the screen dims to black, the final line appears in silence, but the shockwaves didn't stop in that room. They were only beginning. The moment had barely ended, and already it was everywhere. Screens flickered across living rooms, offices, classrooms, and cafes. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's measured words dominated every feed, slow-motion repeats of her gaze, her pauses, the calm precision of every syllable. The microphones had fallen silent in the chamber, but online, the conversation roared. Headlines multiplied like wildfire. Crockett School's speaker in livehearing.com/class. Courage, the pause that stopped the house. Each title carried the same undercurrent. This wasn't just political theater. It was a reflection of the power of composure. Hashtags trended on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Hashtag yield this, hash truth over gavel, hashtag Crockett moment. Every post seemed to repeat the same refrain. Millions had been thinking it, but she had spoken it. Memes popped up in playful reverence. GIFs replayed her 2-second pause before the rebuttal, and side-by-side comparisons of Johnson's interrupted attempts began circulating, exposing the contrast between authority and authenticity. Commentators from across the spectrum weighed in. Allies praised the courage, the intellect, the unshakable resolve. She didn't just respond. One analyst said, she reframed the conversation. Political opponents, caught off guard, tried to maintain decorum. Some couched admiration in reluctant tones. Even if you disagree with her policy, you have to respect the delivery. Television panels dissected every frame. One clip showed a liberal anchor leaning forward. Look at that calm, deliberate tone. That's what leadership looks like in the 21st century. Across the aisle, a conservative commentator added, she made the chamber listen. That's undeniable. The debate wasn't about party lines anymore. It was about recognition of skill, of composure, of undeniable presence. The montage quickened jump cuts between tweets of awe, interviews with constituents, news alerts pinging phones worldwide. Mothers texted daughters, watch this, that's how you stand your ground. Students replayed the clip for homework assignments on civics, analyzing not just what she said but how she carried herself. Her words became a teaching moment, a symbol for those who felt unheard. In offices across the country, groups of colleagues paused, letting the clip play in silence before commenting. She's a reminder, one whispered, that restraint is strength. In cafes, quiet conversations erupted spontaneously. Patrons debated tone, intention, and courage, nodding at one another as if sharing a secret truth. Political analysts noted the cultural resonance. Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman delivering a rebuttal, she was a living example of what it meant to resist being silenced. Every interruption she had ever faced, every dismissal, every underestimated gesture had built toward this moment. Now, she was the embodiment of dignity meeting defiance, a mirror for the nation to see what could happen when truth is unwavering. Even in spaces where partisanship ran deep, there was grudging acknowledgement. Opponents admitted her composure, demanded respect. I can't argue with that kind of presence, a seasoned representative said quietly in a televised segment. It's rare to see someone own the room without raising their voice. The viral wave didn't stop at praise. It sparked reflection. Social media users shared personal stories of moments when they'd been silenced, when authority had tried to drown their voices. Each post tagged hashtag yield this, creating a collective testimony of resilience. News outlets highlighted the broader implications. Editorials framed Crockett's actions as a lesson for leadership, civics, and democracy itself. Students, activists, and everyday citizens found themselves repeating her words, discussing them in community meetings, and circulating the clips as evidence of what accountability looks like when met with unwavering calm. The narrative coalesced into a single truth. This was no longer just a congressional hearing. It was a moment that crossed political boundaries, social divisions, and geographic borders. Within hours, her words had become a national reflection, a reminder that integrity and composure could shift perceptions faster than anger or spectacle ever could. And amid all the viral fame, one thing remained clear. Crockett wasn't just participating in the moment, she had become the symbol. A woman who refused to yield had reminded an entire nation what courage looks like when paired with dignity. The montage slows, focusing on the small, subtle acknowledgments, the nods from opponents, the quiet smiles from colleagues, the reverent silence in offices as the clip loops again. Even amidst debate, there was shared respect. The narrator concludes, solemn and cinematic, but behind the viral fame lay something deeper, something America desperately needed to hear. The chamber lights dimmed, the echo of gavel strikes fading into memory, and yet the moment lingered, not in news reports, not in viral clips, but in something far deeper. It lived in the pause between words, in the weight of truth standing firm, in the quiet realization that authority alone does not command respect. Jasmine Crockett's rebuttal had been more than political strategy. It had been a lesson in courage, composure, and the power of integrity. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't sought spectacle. She simply refused to yield to interruptions that were meant to diminish her not just as a congresswoman, but as a representative of every voice historically overlooked. In that refusal, the narrative shifted. This wasn't ego. This wasn't ambition. This was dignity asserting itself. The narrator's voice threads through the scene. Respect is not granted by title. It's earned by truth. The words resonate far beyond the chamber walls, reaching classrooms, homes, and living rooms across the nation. They echo in every context where authority tries to silence principle. In every space where identity has been questioned or dismissed, Crockett's moment became emblematic of a broader truth. Leadership isn't the loudest voice in the room, it is the clearest. It is the one grounded in justice, empathy, and moral conviction. She reframed the debate not as a contest of power, but as a demonstration of what leadership should look like. Her victory was subtle, almost imperceptible to those who only watched, for drama but unmistakable to those who knew how history is made. This was about more than a single hearing, more than a single interruption. It was about representation, about seeing someone who embodies resilience and integrity rise above the noise. For women, especially women of color, it was a mirror. For young leaders, it was a blueprint. For the nation, it was a reminder that even in spaces dominated by hierarchy and tradition, courage and conviction can set the record straight. As the narrative unfolds, it becomes clear that Crockett's triumph was also collective. Every individual who has ever been interrupted, dismissed, or underestimated found validation in her calm power. Each viewer, whether a constituent or an everyday citizen, could feel the ripple. One voice standing firm has the potential to ignite courage in millions. The narrator emphasizes the universal takeaway. When one voice stands tall, millions find their own courage. It is not just a story of one woman besting another politician. It is a story of justice prevailing over arrogance, of principle prevailing over pretense, and of quiet power prevailing over performative authority. Her composure and restraint became a symbol, a proof that strength doesn't need volume to resonate, that moral clarity doesn't require spectacle, and that dignity cannot be silenced by interruption. The chamber itself, once an arena of tension and control, had transformed into a testament to accountability and truth. In that transformation lies the emotional arc for the audience. Outrage softens into admiration. Frustration becomes reflection. Witnessing Crockett's quiet triumph inspires viewers not only to rethink their assumptions about power but also to reclaim their own voices in spaces where they might feel unheard. And as the chamber emptied that night, one truth remained impossible to silence. Integrity, courage, and principle always leave a mark. They ripple through systems, across screens, and into the hearts of those willing to witness them. What happened in that room was more than a political rebuttal. It was a lesson in American values, a moment where dignity triumphed over arrogance, and a reminder that leadership is not inherited, it is earned. In the end, Crockett's victory wasn't measured by headlines or viral clips. It was measured by the inspiration she left behind, the courage she sparked, and the example she set. The chamber might have emptied, but her voice and the moral clarity it carried continued to resonate. Respect is earned, truth matters, courage inspires. And when one person refuses to yield, an entire nation can pause, reflect, and rise. Jasmine Crockett had done more than respond. She revealed something the chamber already knew but hadn't yet seen. In shutting down Mike Johnson, she didn't humiliate him. She illuminated the truth. Every pause, every measured word, every refusal to yield became a mirror, reflecting integrity in a space too often dominated by ego and interruption. The audience didn't just react, they collectively realized they were witnessing a lesson in courage and composure that would outlast the gavel strikes and headlines. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room isn't the one shouting, it's the one that refuses to be silenced. That is the lesson Crockett delivered, not with volume, but with clarity and conviction. It is a lesson for every viewer who has ever been interrupted, underestimated, or dismissed. It is a call to recognize that dignity, once demonstrated, resonates far beyond a single moment. If you believe dignity still matters in public life, share this story. Let it ripple through your communities, your networks, and your conversations. Let it remind others that standing firm, speaking truth, and maintaining composure can shift entire narratives. Subscribe for more voices that turn interruption into impact. For stories that remind us that leadership is measured not in dominance, but in the courage to hold fast to principle. And as the screen fades to black, remember this. History doesn't remember who interrupted it, remembers who stood their ground. The chamber emptied, cameras powered down, yet the resonance of that moment lingered. A single voice, unwavering, had created a ripple that could not be contained. It was proof that courage and dignity, once exercised, are forces impossible to silence. Because moments like these aren't just watched, they are felt, shared, and remembered.